The hallway was silent, except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights that flickered with uneven rhythm. Every sound seemed too sharp, too loud. The scrape of a shoe against tile, the faint rattle of a vent overhead. The lockdown siren had long since ceased, leaving behind a hollow stillness, but the fear did not fade with the noise. It deepened, it spread. It clung to every corner like a shadow too heavy to move. They were told to stay put, to remain in their classrooms, to keep the doors locked, the lights off, and their voices lower than whispers. They were told safety depended on silence, yet the silence itself became unbearable, suffocating, and soon, it was no longer clear whether it was protection or a trap. Imagine sitting in the dark, listening for footsteps in the hall, uncertain if they belonged to the people sworn to keep you safe, or to something else entirely. Imagine every creak, every echo, convincing you that the barrier between safety and death was only a thin door, a fragile lock, a promise whispered by frightened teachers who could not control what was outside. Lockdowns were meant to shield, to protect. Yet hidden within that safety was a terrifying reality. The unknown is never sealed out completely. Sometimes what you fear most is already inside. There are stories whispered by survivors, accounts from schools and hospitals, accounts from public buildings where the lockdown siren was followed not by relief but by dread. Stories where the thing everyone was hiding from was not the greatest danger. Stories where confusion and terror became the real enemy, where shadows in the hallway grew longer, and where voices, real or imagined, called from beyond locked doors. A girl once claimed she heard her brother's voice outside her classroom, long after she knew he had fled the building. A man swore that during a lockdown in a hospital ward, the figure walking the halls was not wearing the uniform of any staff. There were children who spoke of scratching sounds against the windows on the second floor, where no one should have been able to reach. Each time, the stories end the same way, with no clear answers, no official report that can explain what was seen or heard. Only the survivors remain, haunted not only by the event itself but by the silence that follows. Silence from the authorities, silence from the community, silence from those who lived it, because speaking it aloud only makes it feel real again. The most disturbing thing about lockdown horror stories is not the terror of an intruder or the chaos of an emergency. It is the way time bends in the silence, how every second becomes unbearable, how the human mind begins to fill empty spaces with things it cannot understand. It is the moment when safety turns to suspicion, when the locked door no longer feels like protection but like a prison. What do you do when the alarm goes off, and you realize you are trapped inside with something you cannot name? What do you do when the voices in the hallway do not belong to anyone you recognize, yet sound close enough to draw you to the door? What do you do when the fear of breaking silence outweighs the fear of being found? There are truths we prefer to keep hidden, that the walls of our schools, our hospitals, our offices are not impenetrable, that safety drills are fragile rehearsals against chaos that does not follow rules, that people crack under silence and pressure, that sometimes fear itself becomes the intruder we can never lock out. Lockdowns were designed to protect us, but in some places, on certain nights, in buildings where the silence felt too thick and the shadow stretched too long, they became something else. They became a stage for dread, a stage for stories that linger unexplained and almost unbelievable, until you hear them told by someone whose trembling voice betrays that they were there, and they still cannot find peace. This is not about what may come through the door. It is about what grows in the silence when you are forced to wait. It is about the sound of breath in the dark, the way fear sharpens every creak of the building until it feels alive. It is about the sense that no one will come for you, because even those outside do not know what is happening inside. A lockdown is meant to hold back danger, but when the hours stretch and the whispers rise, the danger becomes the waiting itself. That is where the horror begins. Not with the sound of breaking glass or the echo of footsteps, but with the realization that safety is an illusion. That the walls cannot protect you from what you carry in your own mind, from the dread of what may be moving silently just beyond your door. These are the stories that remain untold in the news. The stories of those who remember every tick of the clock, every shift of the floor, every faint noise that suggested something had slipped through the cracks of security. Stories that force you to ask the one question no one wants to face. What happens when the walls meant to keep you safe become the very thing that seals you in with your fear? The truth is chilling. Safety is never absolute. And when the world outside fades away, when the sirens go silent and the lights flicker above, you begin to realize that the real horror of a lockdown is not what waits outside. It is what begins to awaken inside. The building was old, though no one truly paid attention to its age until that night. Its walls had been painted over so many times that the cracks beneath seemed to whisper through the layers, faint lines of decay pushing through a mask of brightness. It was not a place built for fear. It was a place meant for learning, for gathering, for the ordinary weight of everyday life. Children filled its halls during the day, and at night the empty corridors were nothing more than silence and dust. That is what everyone thought. It began with an announcement, a voice over the intercom, steady but urgent, asking everyone to remain calm, to lock the doors, to keep themselves hidden until further instruction. There was no explanation at first, no details of what had entered the grounds or what danger lingered outside. Just a command, a warning that felt both vague and absolute. The people inside, students, teachers, staff, looked at one another with expressions that ranged from disbelief to dread. For some, lockdown was routine, a drill repeated so many times that the body moved faster than the mind. Desks pushed against doors, blinds drawn, whispers silenced. For others, especially those who remembered the news, the stories, the tragedies that came before, the sound of that intercom was not a drill. It was the beginning of something they had always feared. At first, the mood was controlled. Teachers calmed children, staff secured doors, and the building fell into an unnatural stillness. But outside, on the edge of the grounds, there were movements that no one inside could see, and the silence that followed the announcement stretched too long. Time became unsteady. 5 minutes felt like 30. An hour stretched into something impossible to measure. Each tick of the clock carried its own weight, and with every second, the air inside grew heavier. Students clutched each other's hands, teachers whispered prayers they had not spoken in years, and staff members pressed their ears to doors as if they could hear an answer in the hallways. The building itself began to change. Shadows seemed thicker, stretching across the walls in unnatural shapes. The light through the blinds flickered as though someone or something was passing in front of the windows. The silence, meant to be protective, started to feel unnatural, oppressive, and as the night wore on, the sense of being safe in numbers began to fracture. People recalled the history of the place. Some spoke of the fire decades ago, when smoke filled the same hallways and the screams of children echoed until walls were rebuilt. Others whispered about the man who had wandered the grounds years earlier, found days later in a locked closet he never should have entered. There were those who claimed the building had always carried echoes, footsteps in the halls when no one was there, faint voices in stairwells that had long since been sealed. These stories had always been dismissed as folklore, the kind of tales children tell each other to make the night more thrilling. But on this night, when the intercom had gone silent and no word came from the outside, those stories returned. Fear has a way of shaping memory, of turning history into warning, of making every rumor sound like prophecy. And as they sat behind locked doors in silence that seemed deeper than ever before, every person inside felt the weight of those old stories pressing down on them. This was not simply a lockdown. It was not just another drill. It was the return of something buried, something the community had chosen to forget, and now, trapped inside walls that were supposed to keep them safe, they began to realize that perhaps the danger had never been outside at all. One boy swore he saw someone standing in the hallway through the crack in the blinds. A tall figure, still as stone, staring directly at his classroom door. He whispered it to his teacher, who told him to stay quiet, to close his eyes, to pray it was nothing. A girl thought she heard knocking from the stairwell, slow and deliberate, as though someone was waiting to be let in. A man in the office at the far end of the building claimed he smelled smoke, though no fire alarm was ever triggered. Each of these details seemed small, insignificant when taken alone. But together, they painted a picture of unease, a sense that the lockdown was not simply a precaution against the outside world. Something else was happening, something that the intercom would never explain, something that the locked doors were not holding back. For those inside, it became clear that the night would not pass quietly. Fear was growing, multiplying, becoming something almost alive, and in the silence, in the suffocating dark, every person began to understand the same terrible truth. History had returned, and it was not finished with them yet. The hours inside stretched into something unmeasurable. At first, everyone thought the lockdown would be temporary, a few minutes of waiting, perhaps an hour. and then a reassuring voice would return on the intercom, telling them it was safe to resume life as normal. But the intercom never came back. The building seemed to swallow sound whole, leaving only the faint creak of pipes and the restless shuffle of those who dared to move. It was in that silence that the first unsettling detail revealed itself. A door that had been locked was found slightly ajar. A teacher swore she had secured it, twisting the latch until she heard the click. Yet when she checked again, the door was open, its handle cold to the touch as if someone had just released it. She closed it quickly, but her hand shook when she whispered to her class that it must have been her mistake. Minutes later, children began whispering of footsteps in the hallway. At first, their teachers silenced them, insisting it was the echo of movement from another classroom. But as the sound grew closer, deliberate, steady, it became harder to deny. The steps moved past doors one by one, pausing briefly at each, as though someone were listening from the other side. Those who dared to look through the narrow slits of the blinds claimed they saw shadows that did not belong to anyone they knew. Long and stretched, crossing the hallway in ways that suggested a figure standing just beyond sight. Once, a child gasped that she saw someone kneeling at the base of her classroom door, though when her teacher pressed an eye to the crack beneath, there was nothing. Phones were used at first, small glimmers of screens in the dark as messages were sent to family, to authorities, to anyone outside. But as the night deepened, signal began to fail. Messages sent did not deliver. Calls dropped before they could connect. Some swore their phones picked up faint voices on the line, muffled words, static, something that did not sound like their loved ones. One girl threw her phone to the floor and refused to touch it again, whispering that the voice on the other end had called her by name before she ever spoke. The contradiction between what was heard and what was known began to eat away at reason. Officially, there was supposed to be order outside. Sirens should have been audible. Lights from patrol cars should have flashed through windows. Instead, there was nothing. The world outside seemed erased, leaving only the sealed building, the locked rooms, and the sense that everyone inside was forgotten. And then came the sounds that no one could explain. A loud crash in the gymnasium that shook the floor. A scream from the stairwell that began high and human but ended in a guttural rasp that no one could recognize. Lights flickered, humming as if power was struggling to stay alive, before plunging sections of the building into near-total darkness. Teachers tried to calm their students with explanations, but the words never sounded convincing. A pipe had burst. The generator was faulty. Someone outside had shouted in anger, but deep down they knew. They felt the wrongness settle into their bones. Each sound carried intention. Each flicker of light seemed timed to coincide with movement in the shadows. Whispers began to circulate inside the classrooms. That someone had slipped into the building before the lockdown began. That the lockdown itself was a trap, orchestrated to gather everyone in one place. That the footsteps belonged not to intruders but to something that had always lived within the walls. Fear twisted into suspicion. Students eyed one another with mistrust, wondering if every face belonged to someone who was supposed to be there. Hours passed, though no one could tell how many. Hunger gnawed at the younger children. Thirst left lips cracked and throats dry, yet no one dared to leave, even to search for water. The hallways had become forbidden ground, a stage where things unseen moved freely. At times, faint laughter echoed down the corridor, though no one could tell if it was the voice of a child or something mocking the very idea of safety. One boy recounted, with trembling certainty, that he had seen his mother standing in the courtyard, though she had no way to enter. She beckoned him through the window, her mouth moving silently as she pointed to the door. He pressed against the glass, calling to her in whispers, but she did not respond. When he looked again moments later, she was gone, leaving only the pale imprint of her face in his mind. His teacher insisted it was his imagination, but the boy sobbed through the night, swearing he had seen her eyes. Fear was no longer contained. It spread like smoke, filling every locked room, slipping into every thought. The certainty of safety was gone, replaced by the realization that they were trapped not just physically but mentally. Each sound, each shadow became proof that something was wrong, that the lockdown had shifted from procedure to nightmare, and still the footsteps returned. Always moving, always pausing, always listening. Whoever, or whatever, walked those halls never tried to force a door open, never broke through glass or locks. It only lingered, patient, deliberate, as if it knew time itself would erode the resolve of those hiding. The mystery grew thicker with each hour. No announcements came. No rescue arrived. The building remained sealed, an island of dread in a world that felt impossibly distant. And those inside began to ask the question that no one wanted to voice aloud. If nothing was outside, then why were they still locked in? When the doors were finally unlocked in the days that followed, the building should have returned to its ordinary silence. Students should have gone home, parents should have embraced their children, and the entire event should have dissolved into little more than a frightening memory. But that is not what happened. What lingered were fragments, details that refused to align, testimony that never added up. It was as if the building itself had swallowed the truth, leaving only splinters behind. The first clue came from the security footage. Cameras had recorded every hallway, every stairwell, every locked corridor. Yet when investigators reviewed the hours of silence, entire sections of film were corrupted. Screens flickered with static. Frames looped endlessly, or worse, blank stretches of nothing replaced what should have been long minutes of footage. In some places, shapes were visible, blurred silhouettes moving along walls where no human had walked. In others, the screen warped entirely, bending light until hallways appeared stretched, distorted, like reflections in broken glass. Officials dismissed it as malfunction, yet those who viewed the tapes at night swore they heard faint whispers in the static, voices not captured by microphones but embedded deep in the distortion itself. The second clue came from notes left behind. During the long night, some of the older students had written messages on scraps of paper, words they were too afraid to speak aloud. Those scraps were collected in the days after, folded into pockets or left scattered on desks. Many were simple. "I am scared, I think I hear something, I want to go home." But others described details too precise to ignore. One paper read, "There is someone outside the door. He is not moving. He is breathing but not human." Another, scrawled with shaking handwriting, said, "Do not look through the window. They know when you do." Teachers left testimonies as well. One spoke of hearing her own name whispered directly outside her classroom, though none of her students had dared to speak. Another swore that when she looked into the hallway through the glass panel in her door, she saw her reflection staring back at her. Only the reflection was delayed, smiling long after her own lips remained still. The office staff reported phone calls they could not explain. The building's internal line rang several times throughout the night, yet when the calls were answered, only silence lingered. Later, when the records were checked, there were no incoming calls logged at all. The phones should have been dead during the lockdown, and then there were the smells. Multiple accounts described the faint odor of smoke drifting through the hallways, though no fire was ever found. Others spoke of the scent of soil, damp and heavy as if earth itself had been unearthed within the walls. One janitor claimed he smelled something metallic, sharp, like rust or blood, though he never found a source. Psychologists who studied the survivors later suggested these were signs of collective trauma. The human mind under stress creates patterns out of shadows, voices out of silence. Perhaps it was nothing more than panic feeding panic. Yet even the most skeptical could not explain the contradictions. Why did multiple classrooms describe the same exact footsteps, pausing at the same doors despite being separated by entire hallways? Why did children describe the same tall figure outside, even down to the detail of its hands pressed against the glass, when none had spoken to each other? One of the most disturbing details came from the youngest children. Several described a woman walking the hallways, her hair long and dark, her face pale and unfamiliar. They said she knocked gently on doors, whispering that she could take them home. Some claimed she carried a lantern that flickered like a candle. But no woman matching that description was ever found, and no staff member resembled her. As the evidence was pieced together, one truth became unavoidable. The lockdown was not only a response to an external threat. Something had happened inside, something unexplainable, and whether it was human, psychological, or something that defied both, no one could say for certain. The investigators sealed many of the records. Reports were filed but not released. Security footage was stored away, accessible only to a select few. When parents demanded answers, they were told it was procedure, a precaution, nothing more. But the survivors knew better. They carried the memories, the sights and sounds that refused to fade. They knew what they had seen, even if no one believed them. The building itself remained open. Children returned to class. Staff walked the halls. Life resumed as though the night had been nothing more than a strange dream. Yet the clues lingered, whispered among those who were there. They spoke of the scratches that appeared on locked doors, too high for any child to reach. They spoke of the faint tapping that echoed through vents long after the lockdown ended. They spoke of classrooms where the temperature dropped suddenly, breath visible in the air though the heat remained on. And at night, when the building was empty, those who passed by swore they still saw figures moving in the windows, long after the last child had gone home. The analysis never reached a conclusion. For every theory, a contradiction remained. For every logical explanation, an anomaly persisted. The truth, if it ever existed, lay buried within those walls, hidden between corrupted frames of film and scraps of trembling handwriting. What did the footsteps belong to? Why did the intercom never return? What did the children see when they swore someone stood outside their doors? No one could answer, and perhaps no one wanted to. The deeper you look into the clues, the more hollow they become, the more they lead not to answers but to silence. The kind of silence that lingers heavy, suffocating, like the night of the lockdown itself. And it is in that silence that the real horror takes root, not in what was seen or heard, but in the knowledge that whatever it was, it has never been explained, never been resolved. It remains waiting somewhere between memory and evidence, alive in the very absence of truth. The children who walked out of the building that morning did not look like the ones who had entered the day before. Their faces were pale, drained of expression, eyes wide as though still searching the shadows of a room they had already left behind. Parents rushed to hold them, but the embraces were not met with the relief they expected. Instead, the children clung tightly, as if afraid their parents would disappear the moment they blinked. Many of them refused to let go at all. The teachers were not much different. Some could not bring themselves to speak of what had happened, their voices breaking the moment questions were asked. Others spoke too quickly, their words tumbling out in fragments, contradicting each other, as though their memories themselves had been torn apart by something they could not understand. When officials asked for reports, many of them simply shook their heads, insisting that they had already forgotten, though their trembling hands betrayed otherwise. In the weeks that followed, the community tried to resume a sense of normalcy. The building reopened. Classes continued. Students returned, some reluctantly, others forced by parents who wanted to believe the lockdown was nothing more than a mismanaged drill. But the atmosphere inside was different. The air felt thicker, as if the walls remembered. Doors creaked more than before, lights flickered more often, and the silence in the halls seemed to stretch longer between footsteps. Children whispered about nightmares. Dreams of the figure in the hallway who pressed his hands against the glass. Dreams of the woman with the lantern who whispered their names. Some woke screaming in the middle of the night, convinced they still heard footsteps outside their bedroom doors. Parents dismissed it as trauma, as imagination. Yet even the most skeptical found it difficult to ignore the detail with which their children described the voices, the faces, the smells. They were too precise, too consistent. Teachers began to notice changes as well. Children who once laughed freely now sat in silence, staring at the door as if waiting for it to open. Others refused to sit near windows or would cover their ears when the intercom clicked on, no matter what words followed. Even in daylight, during lessons, fear lingered like a shadow that could not be swept away. For adults, the impact was quieter, but heavier. They carried guilt that gnawed at them in private moments, the guilt of not protecting their students, of not speaking up when they knew something was wrong, of closing their eyes and hoping the night would pass. Some could not walk into the building again, resigning from their jobs rather than face another moment in those halls. Others continued to work, but never after dark, leaving the building long before the last light in the sky faded. In the community, a paranoia took hold. Rumors spread, not just about what happened that night, but about what else might be hidden. Some claimed the lockdown had been staged, a cover for something darker. Others whispered that the building itself was cursed, that the fire decades ago, the intruder years before, and now this night were all connected, a cycle that would never end. Parents debated whether to send their children elsewhere, but fear held them in place. Where else could they go? How could they be certain another building, another school, another lock on another door would keep them safe? The trauma was not contained to memory. It began to show in the body. Children fell ill with unexplained fevers. Teachers developed migraines that persisted for weeks. Nightmares became so frequent that some families reported their children had stopped sleeping entirely, too afraid of what dreams might bring. A counselor who worked with survivors described it as a silence that lives inside them now, a silence that could not be filled no matter how much they tried to talk. Even those who had not been in the building during the lockdown felt its weight. The community carried it like a scar, visible in the way people glanced at the school when they passed, in the way conversations faltered when the subject arose, in the way the intercom's buzz, once routine, now sent a shiver through anyone who heard it. And yet, despite the trauma, despite the silence, there was something more. An undercurrent of dread that the night had not truly ended. Survivors described moments when they felt watched even in their own homes, as though the presence that moved through the halls had followed them out. Parents reported their children waking to voices that whispered from the closet. A teacher claimed she heard footsteps pacing her living room at night, though she lived alone. A janitor swore that when he returned to the building weeks later, he saw a child crouched in the hallway. Though every classroom was empty, the lockdown was over, but its shadow remained, seeping into the minds and lives of those who had endured it. They had locked the doors, shut out the world, and still the terror had found them. And now it lived on, not in the building itself, but in the people who carried its memory. The emotional and psychological damage was not measured in statistics or reports. It was measured in the way a child refused to face the door, in the way a parent stayed awake through the night, in the way a teacher avoided her own reflection in the mirror. It was measured in silence and paranoia, in the knowledge that no explanation could undo what had happened. And perhaps that is the most horrifying part of all. Not the footsteps, not the figure, not the voices in the hall, but the aftermath, the way fear does not end when the lights return or the locks are undone, the way it roots itself in the mind and the body and the very fabric of a community, until nothing feels certain anymore, until every creak of a floorboard, every shadow at the edge of vision, every flicker of light carries the question that no one dares to speak. What if it comes back? When officials arrived, they presented their findings with the same practiced tone they always used. Calm, authoritative, meant to soothe rather than disturb. The lockdown, they said, had been triggered by a possible threat outside. Nothing had been confirmed. The procedure was standard. The reports of footsteps, voices, and shadows could be explained by stress, fear, and imagination. The corrupted footage was the result of outdated cameras, and the phone records showed nothing unusual. The message was clear. There was no mystery here, only panic stretched too far. But behind the scenes, those who combed through the evidence were not convinced. Too many contradictions remained. Too many witnesses told the same story. Too many details refused to disappear under the weight of simple explanations. For every line in the official report, there was an undercurrent of silence, of omissions that spoke louder than what was written. Files were sealed, interviews were cut short, and the case was closed far sooner than it should have been. That silence left a vacuum, and in that vacuum, theories began to grow. The first was the simplest, that the lockdown was staged. Some believed it had been orchestrated by the authorities themselves, a way of testing how a community would react under pressure. Why else had there been no visible threat outside? Why else had the intercom fallen silent? Supporters of this theory pointed to the corrupted footage, suggesting it was not malfunction but tampering. The screams, the knocks, the footsteps, all distractions planted to measure fear. If this was true, then the community had been nothing more than a controlled experiment. And yet, if that was the case, why had some refused to return to the building? Why had the survivors described details too personal, too raw to have been manufactured? The second theory reached back into history. The building, some said, carried its own curse. The fire decades earlier, the intruder years before, the whispered stories of footsteps in the halls. Each event had carved something into its walls. The lockdown was not a test. It was the building itself, alive in ways people refused to understand. Some spoke of places where tragedies linger, feeding on memory, growing stronger with each repetition. If the building had already witnessed horror once, then perhaps it had learned to create it again. Perhaps the figures seen in the hallway were not intruders, but echoes, remnants of something burned into the structure itself. The third theory was darker still. There were those who believed the lockdown had opened something, a door not meant to be opened. They pointed to the testimony of the children who saw the woman with the lantern, the voices calling people by name, the reflections that moved out of sync. These, they argued, were not human tricks of fear. They were signs of intrusion from something beyond. Not ghosts, not folklore, but something outside the reach of explanation. Some called it a presence. Others refused to give it a name at all. Whatever it was, it had used the silence of the lockdown as its invitation. None of these theories could be proven. Yet none of them could be dismissed either. For every skeptic who argued that fear explained everything, there was a survivor who insisted the details were too sharp to ignore. A reflection that smiled without reason, a voice that whispered a name never spoken aloud, a figure that left no shadow, no sound yet stood in plain sight. These were not inventions of panic. They were experiences carved into memory, as real to the survivors as the walls around them. Investigators who pressed too deeply found themselves silenced. Files went missing. Notes were lost. One officer who had interviewed several children resigned suddenly, moving away without explanation. A technician who reviewed the corrupted footage claimed privately to have seen something in the static, a face staring directly at the camera, though no one else believed him. He left his job within weeks. The community split along lines of belief. Some accepted the official story, forcing themselves to move on, to bury the unease beneath routine. Others clung to their theories, whispering them in secret, fearful that speaking them aloud would make them real again. Families argued, friendships fractured, and the silence of the night seemed to echo through the town long after the doors had reopened. And then, there were those who did not believe in theories at all. They believed in survival. They refused to step inside the building again. They moved their children to other schools, left jobs behind, even relocated entirely. For them, the investigation did not matter. They did not need an explanation. They had felt something in the silence, something in the footsteps, something in the way the building seemed to breathe around them. And they knew it would not end simply because someone had written the word closed on a file. No one agrees on what happened that night. Some cling to the idea of experiment, of human control behind the fear. Others whisper of curses, of buildings that trap history and force it to replay. And some, still trembling in their sleep, insist it was something else entirely. Something that slipped in when the doors were locked. Something that had been waiting for silence to grow strong. Theories offer comfort because they give shape to the unknown, but the truth of that night remains shapeless. It lives in the gaps between testimony, in the corrupted frames of video, in the voices that never should have been heard. And perhaps that is the most unsettling theory of all, that there is no answer, no conclusion, only the knowledge that something happened, something real, and it will never be explained. When the last official left the building and the final report was sealed away, the story should have ended. Yet like all things born from fear, it refused to die quietly. It lingered in the people, in the walls, in the very air that surrounded the community. Silence became heavier, nightfall darker, and the ordinary rituals of life no longer felt ordinary at all. The survivors carried it first, a tremor in their voices, a reluctance to walk alone in hallways, a sudden glance over their shoulders when nothing was there. They tried to speak of it, to make sense of the shadows, the voices, the footsteps, but words only sharpened the memory. So they grew quiet. What they had experienced lived inside them like a second skin, a weight they could never shed. Then came the families. Parents sat awake through the night, listening for sounds in their homes. Unwilling to admit they feared their children might bring something back with them. Some whispered that they had seen changes, strange behaviors, sudden bursts of silence, moments when a child's eyes seemed focused on something no one else could see. At first, these were dismissed as signs of trauma, but as weeks turned into months and the unease did not fade, the whispers grew louder. The building itself stood unchanged, its windows reflecting the sun by day, glowing faintly in the moonlight by night. But people began to avoid it. They crossed the street rather than walk past its doors. At dusk, when the last light drained from the sky, even those who had not been inside that night swore they felt something watching from its windows. Theories remained, of course. Some believed in cover-ups, others in curses, still others in presences that could not be named. But no theory could explain the small details that kept surfacing long after the night was over. Teachers returning for late work claimed to hear the faint hum of the intercom, though no announcements followed. Children whispered that when they walked the halls alone, they sometimes heard a second set of footsteps beside their own. A janitor swore he locked every door, yet returned the next morning to find one left open, its hinges still swinging, as if someone had only just stepped through. The silence that night had changed something. It was no longer the silence of safety, of routine drills and false alarms. It was the silence of a wound, deep and unhealed, echoing across time, and perhaps that is why it still haunts those who were there. Not because of what they saw or heard, but because of what they never understood. Because of the knowledge that some mysteries do not resolve. They wait, they linger, they return when least expected. People began to ask themselves questions they could not answer. If safety itself could not be trusted, then what could? If the locks did not keep danger out, but instead kept them trapped inside with it, what would happen the next time the intercom sounded? Could they ever hear that tone again without feeling the weight of dread crawl up their spine? Could they ever sit in silence again without listening for footsteps in the dark? The most chilling thought was not what happened that night, but what might still happen. For the figure in the hall was never caught, the woman with the lantern was never explained, the corrupted footage was never repaired. These were not closed chapters, they were open doors, unresolved echoes that whispered of a story still unfinished. And it is there, in the unfinished, that fear thrives. Not in the certainty of answers, but in the uncertainty of what lingers unseen. Every survivor of that night carries the same unspoken question. What if the lockdown was never about keeping something out? What if it was about holding something in? If that is true, then the locks may not have protected them at all. They may have trapped them inside with something that should never have been sealed away. And if so, then perhaps it still waits there. In the cracks of the building, in the silence of its empty rooms, listening, patient, waiting for another chance to move freely once more. That is why this story remains, why it spreads in whispers and unsettles even those who never walked those halls. Because deep down everyone knows the truth. Safety is fragile, silence is dangerous, and sometimes the very walls we trust are the same ones that betray us. So when you hear the intercom crackle, when the lights flicker overhead, when the silence of the night seems too heavy, ask yourself, is it just another drill? Or is it something else? The story does not end, it cannot. It waits just as the footsteps waited outside those doors. And one day, when the locks turn and the silence falls again, you may find yourself listening in the dark, realizing that safety has never been real. Only the waiting has been. This is the weight of the disturbing lockdown horror stories. They are not about the night itself, but about the aftermath. The way fear bleeds into the ordinary, the way it follows you home. They are about the questions that never leave, the unease that never dies, the silence that grows louder with each passing year. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all is this. When the next lockdown siren sounds, you will not be able to tell if it is protecting you, or if it is sealing you inside with something you do not want to meet.